Over the course of a distinguished career, David Mayhew has challenged the conventional scholarly wisdom about big questions of American democracy. Over all the years, his work on representation, accountability, elections, political parties, and the separation of powers has altered the way in which political scientists think about those topics and the way we approach their study. David Mayhew is the Sterling Professor of Political Science at Yale, where he has been on the faculty since 1968, when he arrived a few years after receiving his PhD in government at Harvard University. At Harvard, he studied under the century's other great political scientist, or student of American politics, V.O. Key. Over the course of his illustrious career, he's been the recipient of many of political science's highest honors. His book, Divided We Govern, was the winner of the Richard Neustadt Prize for the best book on legislative politics. His work on political parties has been recognized with an award by the American Political Science Association section on political parties and organizations. He was elected a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1984. And in 2002, APSA bestowed its James Madison Award on him. The James Madison Award recognizes an American political scientist who has made a distinguished scholarly contribution to political science. It is awarded only triennially, and David is one of only 11 recipients of this prestigious award. David is the author of 6 books, all of which are classics in the study of American politics. These include Party Loyalty Among Congressmen, Congress, the Electoral Connection, Congressional Elections, the Case of the Vanishing Marginals, Placing Parties in American Politics, Divided We Govern, and America's Congress, Actions in the Public Sphere. And finally, Electoral Realignments, a critique of an American genre. We all hope and expect, especially the Princeton University Press, that the book that will come from these lectures will have the same impact in transforming the way we think about fundamental institutions of American democracy. Welcome, David.
Thanks very much for that intro, Nolan, and it's great to be here. It's great to be back. I've been here several times before. I have very many friends here. I was making a count at least 6 people here whom I had as students, either in class or a dissertation advisor or something, undergrads or grads or whatever. Some old friends, some new friends, very old friends. One teacher of mine is here, George Kateb. Old friends Fred Greenstein and Stan Kelly are here. I want to talk today and the next couple of days from a project I've been working on, and the title to it is Partisan Politics: Why Doesn't the American System Fly Apart? I'm going to wade right into it. I have a fair amount of material, and I'd like to get it onto the table. We can have questions afterward. I guess I'd like to save them since I do have a fair amount of material, including some, I think, 4 or 5 charts. The American system, by that I mean the American separation of powers system at the national level, and it can be a lot of bad stuff go on. That is, muscle-flexing presidents starting wars and all that, aggressive parties, windy senators, gridlock, ugly conflict. A lot of messiness can be there. So it's a lot of ricketiness is there, sometimes seen and sometimes wondered how the whole business can stay together. In fact, Woodrow Wilson wondered that, didn't he? He thought it didn't really stay together. It needed to be renovated in an important constitutional way. But there are a lot of accounts of why the whole system doesn't fall apart. It works reasonably well. It kind of mopes on over the centuries. But I'd like to explore one particular explanation or account today and in the next 2 days for why the system doesn't fly apart. And it's just one account, and one actually. And what I'm going to talk about pertains to the 3 constitutional institutions that possess electoral bases. That is the President, the Presidency, the Senate, and the House. I'm not going to say anything about the judiciary. There it is. I just won't say anything about it. My intuition going into this is that a government needs to be poised appropriately on an electoral base, or in the American case, a set of electoral bases. It needs to be poised appropriately, or else there might be trouble. There might be legitimacy trouble in the long run, or the middle term. At stake is whether a system is representative enough to inspire legitimacy in its public. I would say at base, that's where we are. That's my general theoretical rubric. I want to, and as an empirical matter, I want to do something with the last 6 decades of American history, after World War II, that is. Through Bush 43, I'm not going to touch anything having to do with the very new Obama administration, but I've taken pains to bring the analysis up through Bush 43 during its 2nd term. There's 6 decades, that means 15 presidencies. Some of them are actually 2 presidencies, Reagan and so forth. You could be a 2 president if you got elected twice. My specific focus, once past an introduction, or once past the first 30 minutes or so, I should say, is the fortunes of domestic legislative proposals that the president signs on to. It's not necessarily originates them, but signs on to in an important way. Roosevelt, for example, didn't originate the Wagner Act, but he certainly signed on to it, made it his own, championed it, and then bragged about it once it got passed. That is to say, domestic legislative proposals championed by the president during those decades. And it's the top ones I'm interested in. That is the ones the president were really interested in getting across on Capitol Hill. Now this is narrow. I mean, I'm not talking about everything having to do with separation of powers. If a full analysis would have to have a much broader scope to it. We'd be worrying about the war powers of the presidency, about Article II, impeachment powers, and so on. I'm interested in foreign policy, military policy, you name it. I'm interested just in this particular sphere of domestic presidential proposals that presidents really want. It's a relational politics that I'm looking at. The president really wants something, what happens? Domestic legislative proposals the president really wants. But this is an important sphere of politics after all. If you don't have a politics where something like the Fair Deal, the New Deal, after all, Bush's tax cut, Clinton's health care plan are the center of things, and in which it becomes important whether or not things get across, then why you I think you're not looking at you're not looking at politics very close to the center. My account here is I'm going to wander through 3 days of talks here, and my account it's an argument I'm making. I would say it's suggestive, it's speculative, it's not Euclidean, it's not a proof, it's rather an argument that extends across a number of points, a number of displays of information, data, and across several decades of history. It has a couple of new data sets, one of them having to do with electoral bases of the presidency, Senate, and House, and the other having to do with legislative proposals, as the president's legislative proposals. It speaks, what I'm doing here, to a number of literatures. Often when I'm writing, I'm watching politics as well as watching literatures and seeing how I want to react to literature that come down having to do with the politics. It speaks to, on Congress, it speaks to literatures from the days of James McGregor Burns back in the 50s and 60s to Keith Crable and the rest of the folks, many of them on the West Coast today. In a nutshell, I want to craft an argument that I want to show anyway, demonstrate for openers, that the electoral bases of the presidency, the House, and the Senate are not all that different from each other and looked at in one particular way, and that the record of policymaking in this sphere of presidential proposals, top ones, is consonant with that non-consonant, put it that way. It's kind of wishy-washy, but consonant with that relative lack of difference across the electoral bases. Now, that having been said, over the last decades there have been important procedural idiosyncrasies that have attended in D.C. We know about that, Senate filibuster and so forth, I'll make a list later, that have threatened or impaired representational legitimacy in D.C., in the District of Columbia, no question about that. That have deviated the politics away from what many people would say is fairness down there, representative fairness. That's quite true. Yet, I'm going to my second lecture, I'll get to that, talk about spheres of idiosyncrasy down there. And these have been local in a sense. They have tended to be time-specific or chamber-specific or policy area-specific, and they've tended to have a beginning and an end in D.C., the spheres of idiosyncrasy. And not only that, a procedural reform in the U.S., I think, is endogenous to the system. As procedural reform drives, targeting spheres of idiosyncrasy in D.C. are as much a part of politics as is most of the rest of the stuff we study. That is to say, what Julian Jellis's studies is as central to American politics as what Doug Arnold studies, put it that way, to put it in Princeton terms. I think that's true. I think it's a major and consequential property of the American system that reform drives are endogenous to it. Now, I think that I'm still in a nutshell. The end of the argument will be, if what I'm saying makes sense, it'll come as no surprise that there's almost no support in the American public for reforming the American Constitution, at least as it involves this representational area. Despite the wishes of some social scientists and lawyers who write about these things, there seems to be virtually no support in the American public for monkeying with the American Constitution on the representational front. Now, to go on, that's the nutshell. In general, I think it's important to say as a preface that it really can be a problem to poise a government on an electoral base or electoral basis. At stake, at issue, is what kinds of constituencies are represented by whom, after all. And some instances of difficulties that can arise, historical instances, let me cite a couple. In Britain in the 19th century, possibly the most famous of instances, the Reform Act of 1832, after all, derived from great discontent, having to do with the configuration of constituencies in Britain involving rotten boroughs on the South Coast and other problems. In the USA, mentioned earlier, and during the Wilson administration, 1913 anyway, the 17th Amendment to the American Constitution made a correction in American national representative life as the Senate, in the decades it was seen correctly before the 17th Amendment, bringing about the direct election of senators, kind of deviated away and become a kind of Republican outlier institution in some respects. That's been written about too. Those are instances of poising a government on electoral basis that went wrong, sort of. That is, Britain before the 1832 Reform Act, the U.S. Senate before the 17th Amendment. Now, there can be, it'll be clear that there can be problems of this sort when a government is poised, or it has been tried to be poised by the people who brought it about, on three separate electoral bases at once, as in the case of the House, the Senate, and the Presidency. That can be a real problem. So triply poising at a government on electoral basis. Relational considerations come in when that when a triad is its representative triad is at stake. And its focus here again is the ensemble of American national elective institutions since World War II through. And I'm dealing with elections through the election of 2004. I haven't picked up the 2008 election yet. I make heavy use of a particular data set, of a particular statistic, I should say, a particular statistic in the first part of my talk here. It has to do with the division of the national major party popular vote cast for president. That's a mouthful. The division of the national major party vote cast for president. For example, in 2000, it'll be let's say the Gore vote over the Gore plus Bush vote, a ratio. The Gore vote over the Gore plus Bush vote. This national popular vote statistic is available always for the whole country. There could be murkiness down at the bottom. There are count problems and all that. But in all of American history, probably in American public life, no political statistic having to do with elections is more important than national popular vote count or national popular vote share between the major parties. As it happens, the national popular vote for president share is available for the whole country. It's also available for the lower units, the subsidiary units of the system, since 1952 anyway. You can see what the national popular vote share was in the Senate districts, that is to say in the states, and in the House districts, that is to say the individual 435 House constituencies, as well as the whole country. You can also see, what's, for that matter, what the popular vote share was in the Electoral College universe, which is somewhat, it adds together, as you know, the House and the Senate universes in its particular fashion. What I do is, one thing I do in preface here is to play the national popular vote for president share through the constituencies, through the universes of constituencies. The universe of constituencies. And focusing on the medians in the constituencies. That is, let's just say you've got the national popular vote in the whole country. Then let's say in the House, you can figure out what the Gore over Gore, Bush plus Gore vote was in each of the 435 constituencies, and you line up the 435 according to how Gore they were as opposed to how Bush they were. And the middle constituency, the pivotal constituency, is the median constituency in the country. And it is the constituent, it is not the median House member, but it's the median constituent in the country represented by some House member down there in D.C. once the election is over. The same can be done for the Senate constituencies, the 50 of them. The national popular vote share is often used by political scientists. It's been used, for example, down here by Paul Freimer in his writing. It's an indicator of constituency texture. the basic ideological nature of constituency, widely used for that. We look to see how Maine voted and see how Nebraska voted and so forth for president. In that sense, it's a kind of absolute thermometer into a constituency to see what its ideological texture is. The national popular vote share can also have a signaling effect in the near term, in the very near term, that is just after an election, as we find out right now. We see right now some, for example, some states that voted well for Obama have seen their senators support Obama's stimulus plan. That is, the Maine senators, the women from Maine, Snow and Collins, as well as Specter down there in Pennsylvania, are the equivalent, in a sense, of Max Baucus from Montana in 2001, who supported Bush's tax cut plan in a very important way. A couple of months after Montana had voted for Bush by 25 points in the 2000 election. There it is. We see these things. We know these things. These are well-known American political life. Now, the median constituency in the House and the Senate is important, because median is important, after all, in the House and the Senate, given that they are, the House in particular, but the Senate more than one might think, majority rule institutions. My intuition here is that if the system manages to keep the presidential vote nationwide popular, and the medians, or put the vote, that vote as it appears in the medians of the House universe, the universe of House constituencies, the universe of Senate constituencies, those two medians, the values of them for the House, for the national popular vote, are pretty close to the actual national split, then the system has got some kind of integrative order to it. That is, the odds of the likelihood of serious conflict or of gridlock and the rest falling apart will diminish. To give an example of what level of problem can arrive, given this kind of thinking about constituencies, I'd like to give you two examples. Let me give you two extreme examples. These are ones that old-timers like me would remember. Is Fred Greenstein here? Fred would remember. Both of us lived in Connecticut, and this was still live stuff. Is that going up all right? Yes, it is. Okay. Now, the states, I'm going to put this on and then go right past it. I want to give it an extreme instance of the kind of a dissonance that can come about in a representational system where you've got three different institutions poised at once on the same electorate. These are Rhode Island, Connecticut back in the old days when one of the state legislative houses in each of these states was way out there representing cows rather than people, more or less. The small towns in the Connecticut Assembly, small towns in the Rhode Island Senate made these institutions much more Republican than the whole state was during these decades that I'm talking about here. In the case of Rhode Island, the way I played the statistics through in this fashion, it's the vote for the Democratic candidate for governor in the election of 1934. And as it happens, that was the old Senator Theodore Francis Greene getting elected governor then, I think re-elected at that time, with a 57.2% edge in Rhode Island, which had become a pretty Democratic state after all. Governor Greene's vote in the median assembly district, arraying the assembly districts according to what his vote was, what his vote share was, is 55.1%. But in the median state Senate district, you see, it was 47.9%, giving a dissonance score for the system of 9.3%. In Connecticut in 1954, by the same kind of scorekeeping, you get a dissonance score of 7.7%, there with the Republican Assembly being a big outlier. These are picked for their extremeness, but they're not unreal. They're instances in the American system of representational dissonance of the sort that I'm discussing. And in fact, there were policy consequences of this dissonance in these states. In Rhode Island, the Republicans in the state Senate had been blocking a lot of things that Democrats wanted to do episodically for a long time. And in fact, after this 1934 election in Rhode Island, in which the Republicans did manage to keep control of the Senate, there was, in effect, a coup d'etat in Rhode Island, whereupon the Democrats called in the cops and threw out a couple of Republicans from the Senate and took over the state. It was like a banana republic for a while in Providence there. In Connecticut, there wasn't any coup after the 54 election, but it's been said, I think it's my old professor, V.O. Key, who claimed it, that Connecticut traveled on for something like 3 generations without enacting an income tax, because even though that proposal was commonly proposed by governors, it was always blocked by the Assembly, which was so skewed over in a rural direction, a rural small town direction. That's an instance of extreme. All right. But now back to the nationwide USA post-World War II. What do we see there? Now, note, by the way, before I put any figures up, that in the American national system, especially the Senate, could be out there causing big problems. The disparity in population between Wyoming and California last time around of the census was 69-1. In fact, and of course they both get 2 senators, and in fact the U.S. Senate, there's a recent study by, I think it was by Samuels in Minnesota and a co-author, has it that the U.S. Senate is one of the most malapportioned legislative assemblies, national legislative assemblies in the world. There's no doubt about it. The House, after all, is not thus malapportioned, but nonetheless the Senate. The Senate could be causing particular problems of this Rhode Island or Connecticut kind that I show in the chart I just put up. All right, but does it? Chart number 1 is a little off the picture. Get that on there, all right? Yes. I'm going to start, not with the House and the Senate, but with the Electoral College. See, the same kind of logic can be addressed to the Electoral College. The Electoral College is made since the middle 1960s. It's made up of 51 units. That is, it's got the 50 states plus D.C. And in those 51 units, also you can tell what the, let's say, what the major popular vote share was of the presidential national popular vote. There we are, for each election. And you can array the 51 Electoral College units also along a dimension according to how Gore they were, how Bush they were, and see what the pivotal unit is there. The pivotal unit being, for example, Florida in 2000, which is the one, if it went one way rather than the other way, would tip it, and indeed it did tip it. So it's interesting to look and see. There's another universe of constituencies. There's your Electoral College constituencies, a little different from the House, a little different from the Senate. All right, as it happens, over these 15 elections, actually 16 elections, since I've tacked on the 2000, have I done this? Yes, the 2008 election into my Electoral College series, where it's pretty simple to pick up the vote by state and national, although I can't pick up the House for the presidential vote by House district yet. I haven't seen the data. As it happens, in the Electoral College series, this is over 16 elections. That's right, the first column, let's see, what have I got here? The first column of numbers has the national popular vote share. That's a major party vote for the Democratic candidate. There's Truman, for example, 52.3% in 1948 and all the way to the bottom. Is that what I got? Yeah, that's what it is. Yes, all right. Go over a column. Is this Gore over Gore plus Bush vote, that sort of thing, in the median Electoral College unit all the way down. And you can see there's an uncanny match between the one and the other. In the Electoral College system, looked at this way, there's really no wedge between, on average, over time, over 16 elections, although particular elections can make a difference, as it happened in Florida in 2000, no question about that. The popular vote went one way, and the Electoral College vote went the other. But on average over time, there is no difference. 48.85, 48.84 is a pretty small. And in fact, in 8 of the elections, the Democrats were doing a little better in the Electoral College by this telling than in the popular vote, taken straight. And in the other 8, the Republicans are doing a little better in the Electoral College than they were in the popular vote, taken straight. There's one instance of non-dissonance. I'm going to drop it. I'm going to take up the Electoral College briefly when we get to the 4th lecture, but now I want to stop and go on to something else. And that will be again, the national presidential popular vote, Gore over Gore v. Bush, that sort of thing for each election through 2004 in this case. Same thing in the first column of numbers. Truman is up there again with 52.3%. But now I'm interested in the national, again, presidential popular vote in the median House district and in the median Senate district, that is to say, state. But in this case, I haven't put down the raw percentages in those units. Rather, I've taken a difference between the presidential popular vote in the whole country and its median in the House district in any given election. So I have a trail of numbers under House district there, and then I have a trail of numbers also Senate district there. And I'll move it up a little bit so you can see how it gets to the bottom. As it happens, this machine doesn't allow me to rotate the charts. I could do that in my New Haven one, but this one doesn't do it. What's going on here? What's going on here is the following. There's an uncanny regularity to the results here. So we have 14 figures in the House column and 15 figures in the Senate column. There's no figure for 48 in the House column because they don't have the data. I'm not sure the data are available. I suspect the data are not available for that year. 29 observations. That is 14 under the House, 15 under Senate. In all 29 instances, the median in the House district universe and the median in the Senate district universe was a little bit more Republican than the national popular vote House share. You with me? There is a little bit of dissonance here. There is not dissonance between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote median, but there is dissonance here. There's an uncanny regularity to it. All the 29 instances have a plus sign. They're all GOP favoring, Republican favoring on the congressional side. But another point is they're all small. They're all small differences. That is, on the average down at the bottom, across the 14, there's a 1.1% Republican tilt, so to speak, in the House universe, and a 1.3% tilt, so to speak, in the Senate universe. Now that's small. Compared with what I showed you, Connecticut and Rhode Island, those figures of 7, 8, and 9, or close to 10, these are quite small. They're not nothing, but they are small. Now let me discuss them a little bit before I go on. In the case of the House, what we're seeing here is a pretty well-known thing. That is a concentration effect. That is, Jonathan Rodden has been writing about that recently. Evidently, it's something that has appeared routinely or regularly in the Anglophone countries which have a single district representation. That is to say, populations in the big cities, the voters of the Labor, Liberal, and Democratic parties in these countries tend to cluster more than do voters in the conservative parties, with the result that nationally in the whole system there's a little bit of wasting of votes on the left, so to speak. So one way to put it is you can walk across Manhattan without meeting a Republican, but you cannot walk across Kansas without meeting a Democrat. There's 1 out of 3 in Kansas will be a Democrat. Manhattan, you're talking about maybe 1 out of 8. There are a lot of districts in Manhattan. In fact, New York City, taken large, has always been a big contributor to this concentration skew, I think. Is my mic reaching okay to the back? It's okay up there? All right, good. On the Senate side, so the 1.1% for the House district universe, the Senate side is perhaps a bit of a surprise. That is, the Senate figure is virtually identical to the House figure you see. The 1.3% skew on average is virtually identical to the 1.1% Republican skew on the House side. And what's going on there is that, surprisingly perhaps, this is not purely correct, it's not perfectly correct, but state population size in the Senate district universe, that is to say in the states, is pretty close to orthogonal to the partisan affiliation of the states. There's one, despite the fact that we look out there and we see a lot of Republicans in Idaho and North Dakota and all that, or at least Montana, it's not really a very close relation. There are vest pocket conservative states, or also vest pocket liberal states. There's a bit of a skew, and that'll give you or explain for you the 1.3% tilt, but it's not a great big skew. For example, to put some flesh on it, in the 2008 election, there are 14 states which have 2 or 1 House members. Those are your smallest states in population, 2 or 1 House members, 14 states. Obama carried 7, and McCain carried 7. You've got your wide open spaces states that McCain carried: North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming. But you've also got your vest pocket liberal states in the Northeast that Obama carried: Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island, Delaware. Those are, I think, even New Hampshire now are Democratic states. And Alaska and Hawaii, they split. Those are the other 2. So it's 7 each way, which is, or is it 12? You know, I may be a little off, but that's roughly. No, that's correct. Or I may be a little bit off, but anyway. I'll fix it if I am. Now, how to assess these dissonance figures? Let's call these dissonant figures, the 1.1 and the 1.3. They are uncannily consistent or persistent over time on the end, but I say the differences are are rather small, the 1.1 and the 1.3. It's difficult to know what your yardstick would be for thinking about this. The Rhode Island and Connecticut are not really a yardstick. Those are extreme instances. But there we are. I would suspect, by the way, that the House tilt would look something like, I haven't seen the exact data, it's something like the tilt you would find commonly anyway in the other Anglophone countries in this fashion. Regarding the Senate here, there's a sense in which we've lucked out, in which the USA has lucked out. That is, you can conceive of a universe, of a political universe, in which the U.S. Senate would have gravitated into cow territory, something like the Assembly in Connecticut back in those days, and the State Senate in Rhode Island back in those days, but that hasn't happened, at least in partisan terms. That hasn't happened. There's a kind of lucking out here. Now, the political implications of all this, of this pattern, to try to throw some light on this, I've developed a second data set. And this has to do with, as I say, presidential legislative proposals since World War II, domestic ones. I've left out foreign policy. I don't want to. I have to draw the line. Domestic policy, I've included trade, I've included immigration, I've included the reform of government structure, even what might involve defense or such matters, but I have not included straight foreign policy things like foreign aid or provisioning of wars. Those are not there, or war resolutions. Yes, all right. Presidential legislative proposals, domestic, since World War II. What happens when they're sent over, or when the president endorses them, or puts his weight behind them, as in the case of the Wagner Act in 1935? What happens? Note that this is a couple of things to be said about the politics that encompasses such activity. First of all, it is a relational politics. That is, presidents send over programs, and it's a three-institutional relational thing. That is, you can't get at it by looking at the House or looking at the Senate or looking at the presidency as a containerized institution. I'm interested in relational. That's what the nature of what's going on here. Secondly, the politics in which presidents send over proposals that they really want to have adopted by the Hill. It's a very high prominence politics. High prominence politics. The reporters are there, and afterwards the historians are there. There's a kind of fishbowl quality, finally. There's a fishbowl quality in the instant to what goes on Capitol Hill, but finally there's a fishbowl quality to what went on in the presidency once people start writing their memoirs, including the presidents. A high prominence politics in the instant, which has at least a couple of implications, I think, theoretical as well as empirical. One is that the process in which legislative proposals might be handled that a president's really interested in may be distinctive. And I think that's probably true. That it's not correct to infer that it's typical or average behavior in the House or in the Senate to what goes on in the set of instances in which presidents are really interested. That's at least because presidents can intrude in a big way into Congress in this high prominence kind of context, and they may wish to do it. Another implication having to do with the high prominence of the politics is that it is politics as spectacle. That insofar as politics is spectacle, what we're seeing here, it becomes important what the public sees to happen, sees happening. It is sees happening. Politics is at least, among other, it's at least a spectator kind of thing. And if publics are going to try to figure out whether their institutions are legitimate, there's something they have to watch. There's something at least that they might watch. And one thing they might watch, and can watch closely, the way relational politics is covered when presidents are implicated in a big way, is what happens to presidential proposals once they're sent over that the presidents are in a front-runner way interested in. Yes, the data set I made up is this. I put together a data set of 184 presidential proposals that presidents have sent over or endorsed, as I say, like the Wagner Act, put their weight behind, starting soon after World War II. What I did was to look just at the first halves of presidential terms. I wanted to cost cut and to look, And I figured, I think correctly, that presidents, as domestic legislative innovators, do their most important work during the first halves of their terms, just after they're elected. In fact, there's good evidence for that, as well as good theory behind it. So that's what I did. That's what I looked at. All the statistical work I've got here, and there may be some anecdotes that stray, but all the statistical work is taken from what happens during the first halves of presidential terms. I start with Harry Truman in 1949, after he was elected in 1948. So I'm looking at 1949-50 in the case of Truman there, and carry this through George W. Bush in 2005-06. That is the 2 years after he's elected to his second term. He's elected for the second time. Actually, Truman for the first time in 1948, strictly speaking. What I did was I canvassed accounts of what was going on in the White House at the times that presidents were figuring out what they wanted on Capitol Hill during these first 2 years. To do that, I went through and parsed some 85 accounts by journalists and by witnesses in the White House, like Arthur Schlesinger in Kennedy's case, by academics who write afterwards, there's a good deal of that, and by presidents themselves. Actually, I think all but a couple of the presidents have written illuminating memoirs about their White House years, and yes, there's a rosy glow there sometimes, but nonetheless, it's one source you can look at. You have to look at it with some suspicion. You need to cross-check it with, cross-hatch it with what other people say who are watching, the journalists and such, and the academics that look at the documents. One author I used on this, by the way, to be Princeton-specific, is Fred Greenstein. He had a nice little piece on the politics of the first 2 years of the second Bush administration, 05-06, and he talks down about what Reagan was going after, not Reagan, Bush was going after during his, the year after he got reelected, including chiefly his privatization of Social Security drive in 2005. Now, these are proposals. I went after proposals that I thought the presidents really cared about, and what I did was zero in on evidence about the president's attention, the president's commitment, the president's energy. I made yes-no judgments about whether to put something on a list of such proposals, and also for some purposes I weighted the proposals. That's for some purposes. I'll show you downstream. Let me say that I've got on the table here, I'm not going to put this up on the board, but I've got here, for anybody's interested, a document that lists the presidential proposals that I came up with in the list of 184, as well as the sources that I used in doing it. There's a handout here about 11 pages thick if anybody wants to take a look. For the most part, this was through, as I say, the academics. I had a little bit of trouble in 05-06, or calendar 06. The books haven't been written yet in calendar 06, so I had to wander over a little bit to Congressional Quarterly Weekly to fill out, I thought, plausibly what was going on in 06 in Bush's second term, but there it is. Now, let me give you some sample lists. The heaviest hitter over these years in making proposals, not surprisingly, was Lyndon Johnson. I don't have him as a sample here. He's a little ahead of everybody else in asking Congress to do things that he seems to be really care about, according to this reckoning. I haven't put him down. I'd rather put some other people down. These are instances. I mean, the full list, again, if anybody's interested, I've got what's here for all the 15 presidents. These are, I picked up Eisenhower, 1953, 54. And then I chart whether he won or whether he lost, what in his proposal. But first take the proposal. Look at Eisenhower, 53, 54. The weighting is the right column here. So, and again, they're more interested in some than others. And again, it's a matter of judgment to weight these. It's pretty clear in some instances. Take Reagan in 1981-82. It's very clear. He's very interested in his tax cuts more than anything else. He is interested in his expenditure cuts, OBRA, and it's a great mistake to lose that information. And talking about what's going on in D.C., as with Obama and his stimulus plan right now, it's not your average piece of legislation. It's a matter of judgment what to do and figuring out how to wait, but I think it's a great mistake not to do something in figuring out how to handle these kinds of differences. Eisenhower up at the top. Let's see. He's got a lot of things. He's a little bit. He's significantly interested in, and then a fairly long list that he was considerably interested in. Actually, Eisenhower was more of as Greenstein would tell you, a legislative generator in 53, 54, particularly 1954, than most people think. Reagan in 81 stacked up a lot on the tax cuts and the expenditure cuts, as you see. 1985, 86, I put that in, at least partly to illustrate that these lists differ an awful lot in size. As Reagan, after the 84 election, he had a lot of interest in his Tax Reform Act. He really didn't want that. Otherwise, he kind of went to sleep. In fact, I've got some 7 sources writing about 85, 86, and none of them mentions anything except the Tax Reform Act. It's Reagan himself who chats out a bit in his memoirs about his agriculture bill and his constitutional amendment to balance the budget, which was an obsession with him. He still wanted it. He couldn't get it before, he wanted it again, and he didn't get it again. His big thing was the Tax Reform Act. Everybody agrees on that. But you see the lists vary. Again, Johnson's is the longest. Reagan in his second term is the shortest. That's partly because of Reagan. There's also, not surprisingly, a difference between divided party control and unified party control. That is to say, presidents tend to propose less under divided party control. Why bother? In the case of Bush in 89, for example, Bush the father, presidents tend to propose less in their second terms than their first terms when they have a second term. There's just some systematic things going on here which would not be surprising. Some of them are idiosyncratic rather than systematic. I think Reagan in 85, 86 probably belongs in the former category as much as anything. Clinton at the bottom. This is Clinton's Big Bang Congress in 1993-94, you see. He's got his omnibus budget package, which he pressed through August of that year. His other big drive was for his health care reform, which he pressed in 93-94, both those years, and finally came to a bad end with it in August of 1994. He's pretty big on NAFTA, pretty big on crime. The rest of them I rated as a 1. This is the sort of thing I did, you see, rather I should say the sort of list I came up with, going through the 15 presidencies. Now I want to ask, well, I did ask, and you can see from the sheet. Did they get what they asked for? Now this is I coded this binary, and again, it's a slaughtering of reality to make it binary, because seldom do presidents get everything they ask for in any one proposal that they send over to Capitol Hill. The Hill doesn't lie supinely and agree to the letter of things. We know that. Nonetheless, it's ordinarily easy enough in the context of the way American politics happens and is covered to code for whether presidents get what they want. Take, for example, the Obama stimulus package. Did he get it? Yes, he got it. He got it. It's the bottom line, which everybody agrees to. It's actually I think it's interesting that the scoring of whether presidents get or whether they get or don't get what they want when they ask for it. It's a very interesting thing. It's a public political kind of thing. It's a kind of societal scoring. It's not academics who do this sort of thing. It's politicians and journalists and the presidents themselves who decide whether they got what they wanted or not. So it's quite interesting. There's a kind of clipped list, yes, no, to this question, although not always. Sometimes actually the presidents will sign something even though they didn't want it and got licked. Occasionally that happens. Sometimes they figure they're better off 2 yards away from the goal line, and they wanted 60, they got 2, so they'll sign, whereas the journalists will judge that there was a failure. That happens too. There are instances of that. Now, presidents win-loss. The third column I have there is, I think I coded, or I don't want to, it's not very important, but there's a later. In a very few instances, the presidents didn't get what they wanted during their first Congress, but in the second Congress they did. The same president was there, and in the second half of a presidential term they got it. There are 5 or 6 instances like that I took cognizance of and used the data for some purposes. All right, presidents get what they want. The international standard for this is, according to Jose Shebab, writing across many presidential systems, is 61.6%. There's president across many countries, immense data, immense lists of requests probably in many countries. Anyway, Jose comes up with 61.6%. Here, my answer is 61.3%. Or with weighting 60%. So the U.S. is in the, it's right on the nose. It's on the ball game. The statistic I'm getting here is very close to what you get internationally for what that's worth. All right, a particular thing I'm interested in here is today, to finish this off, is there any sign of party asymmetry in what presidents get? In particular, Democratic presidents versus Republican presidents. The one crowd, there are a lot of Democratic presidents, there's also a lot of Republican presidents since World War II. It'd be better to have 1,000, but still there are, as it dated, 1,000 different presidents to work with. But we do have several going across these 6 decades. Is there any difference we can see? I can see in the success rates of the Democratic presidents as opposed to the Republican presidents. And you can see, you can hypothesize that the slight Republican side tilt of the media, you see, in the House and in the Senate, might make a policy difference. Of course, that would have to be net of all else, including whatever the particular holdings by the parties of members are in the Congress and in the presidency at various times. It would have to be independent of all else. You with me there? But is there anything there? Now, this is a very risky, barely askable or tractable question, given that strategicness is so much in the picture, after all, as presidents are trying to figure what they're going to sign on to and foster and advance in a big way. Very clearly what they want to do in making proposals when they send them over or endorse them in the case of the Wagner Act is to win. There's not much point in general over time for presidents to send up stuff they're going to lose on. So strategicness is the first thing you want to look for. There's calculation, strategy, tactic, where presidents make up proposals. Yet to be sure, that's not the only thing they're interested in. The 61% is really not very high. I mean, if they all are really interested in winning, they ought to be doing better than that in this country and in other countries. But they've got hobby horses, they've got fancies, they're carrying their programs, they're acting in the dark sometimes. Sometimes they think they can merchandise programs with the public, and it's kind of long march through the public to reach Congress. That was an eyes-open calculation, for example, by Jimmy Carter with his energy plan. It was a calculation by Clinton with his health care plan in 93, 94. In both cases, there's a problem marching through the public. The public was not marchable through. But in both cases, there was, you see, the presidents, it just wasn't clear what would happen when presidents sent out proposals. So they lose a lot. But nonetheless, for these various reasons I suggested that they might lose in my last paragraph here, there's no particular reason why Democratic presidents ought to lose any more than Republican presidents, is there? I don't think there is anyway. But there is one possible theoretical wedge here that I want to deal with a little bit. It's this, that the intuition is this. The intuition is this. That there might be a perceptible anyway, it might come out of the data, a promises versus performance dissonance between the Democratic presidents on the one side and the Republican presidents on the other side. The logic could go like this, that when they're winning elections, the presidents will bid at the national median voter position. They'll make up their issue positions and their promises at the site of the national median voter. Both of them will. Both of them will. On average, that's what they'll do. It's straight down Zionism. But to some degree, once they've made promises there to voters, they will stick with their promises. That is, they'll stick with the promises that brung them, so to speak, because they think they should, because of some kind of political pressure from the party, the activists or the interest groups or whatever, to stick with the promises that they made out there in the hustings in October and September. It's not surprising they would do that. It's straight Gladstone. You're supposed to do that if you're running a party. For that matter, it's straight Woodrow Wilson to do that. That's what leaders are supposed to do, make promises and then come in and try to perform on them. But now what might be the case, you see, is that Democrats might get whipsawed more once they come to D.C. If Democrats are trying to stick by their promises, and Republicans are trying to stick by their promises, and therefore propose programs, send over legislative proposals that are true to the promises once they reach D.C., then Democrats might have a little more trouble on the Hill than the Republicans. For that reason, given this 1.1% tilt to the median of the House, to the House median, and 1.3% to the Senate median, there is some anecdotal evidence for this kind of dissonance, promises versus performance dissonance, or rather for a dissonance between promise and performance in the cases of some presidents, and indeed it attaches to Democrats. It looks through this. It's quite interesting. In the case of Harry Truman in 1948, remember Truman beat Dewey by a little. In 1948, came back triumphantly to the presidency in January of 1949 and had a big program. This is what, here's some, David Truman, no relation, David Truman, the great political scientist, wrote about Harry Truman's circumstance in 1949 as a legislative proposer. And I'm going to quote from David Truman. During the campaign, President Truman had in effect committed himself to a program of legislation that was not only extensive, but also at a good many points highly controversial. Truman was almost inevitably a prisoner, nice noun, of the kind of campaign he'd conducted. And he sent his stuff over to Capitol Hill, and on Capitol Hill they killed a lot of it. They killed his civil rights, they killed his national health insurance, they killed his agricultural program in 1949. He had a middle-income housing thing they killed, and that's just it. Taft-Hartley reformed a lot of killing on Capitol Hill of Harry Truman's programs in 1949, as it happens. Something similar was written by Arthur Schlesinger about Jack Kennedy in 1961. Kennedy also comes in narrowly to the presidency in 1960, having propagated a kind of standard Democratic program out on the hustings in September and October of 1960, and also earlier in the primaries. You have to win primaries too, after all. And here's a quote from Schlesinger. Kennedy just knew, once he was sending up his stuff to Capitol Hill, he just knew that he did not have the votes for his more controversial proposals on the Hill. Knew he didn't have the votes, but he sent them up anyway and got clobbered on some of them. Medicare didn't do well on federal aid to education, didn't send up until his second year on civil rights, and he had agricultural problems. It was something like the Truman story over again. The interesting thing here is that some authors who have looked at this without theoretical lenses in their eyes or in front of their eyes have seen what they've seen the kind of dissonance I'm talking about, at least anecdotally. All right, so here's a wedge. You see, here's a theoretical, which might result in an empirical wedge into this question. Here you might expect, for theoretical reasons, with some evidence that can be slapped onto it, a difference between the success rates of Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. Well, I trolled for an answer to this. I tried with this. I mean, this is not the end of any kind of investigation, but I tried. Here's what I did. I took the 184 proposals that the presidents were, again, the ones they're particularly interested in, and I trimmed down 184 for this purpose, just today, in this talk, to 114. I was interested here. I wanted to get it down to the proposals by the presidents that advanced let's say, the core ideological principles of their parties. What does it say? The Democrats on health care, the Republicans on tax cuts. For this purpose, I wanted to leave out, let's say, Jimmy Carter's crusade against water projects in 1977, and this, that, or another. Leave out that kind of stuff. Or presidents who are acting against type, like Nixon with his family assistance plan in 1969. That's against type. I wanted to look here just, as a liberal plan, just at programs that would have advanced the core ideological principles. And I made a list using common sense and history of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. It's not entirely easy to do. For example, back in the 1950s and 60s, the Democrats had free trade as the core ideological principle, as opposed to the Republicans being more protection. These days, the opposite is true. So you have to respect that in wondering or stipulating what the core ideological principles of the party might be. They could change after all. There it is. Down to 114, 184 down to 114. And I pumped that up to 160 by weighting, using the weightings I talked of before. There's Clinton's health care played as a 4. It's not just a 1 for this test out. And I came up with this result. And I'm going to finish with this today. We've just about reached the 5:30 mark. I came up with this result. And an equation. And I couldn't make it work. I couldn't come up with a significant difference here between the success rates of the Democratic presidents and the Republican presidents. There are only two variables in it. One is whether the president is a Democrat. The other is, again, whether party control is unified. You'd expect greater success in party control is unified, after all, rather than divided. And the coefficients are in the right direction, but they're pretty unstable. That is, you're not going to, I don't think you're going to get, they are in the right direction, but they're unstable. They're not stable. So you just, I don't think you can make much out of this. An additional problem is that there are only so many presidents, and you do have to worry about what might happen under the thought rubric of dummy variables per president. That is, some presidents are just kind of strange, maybe. Like Jimmy Carter had more fancies that he sent over to the Hill. There's very little evidence that Carter considered political, or this evidence that often he did not consider political practicality and sending things over to the Hill. It's documented by scholars who have talked to his aides, who were kind of wide-eyed about how Jimmy just didn't care whether something was going to pass. He thought it was the right thing to do. So you see, it might be true that you've got to worry about president specificness. But in the round, over 60 years, over many presidents and many instances, there's I didn't come up with a significant difference here. So there's not much of a case here to use the locution of Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson recently, the off-centeredness of American politics, at least in this sense. I mean, this specific contained narrow sense of the success rates of presidents on the Hill, given that a lot of them will be anchored in campaign promises, after all, that would attract the immediate voter nationally, and not much evidence for the off-center idea. Rather, it's quite possible, in league with what I've been arguing here, that the 1% and the 1.3% are too small to make much of a difference. Now, I think if you were playing this game with Connecticut and Rhode Island back in the first half of the 20th century, you would find something. That is, you would find that the Democratic governors are having more trouble than were the Republican governors during those times in those states where the cows were important in one of the assemblies, or the assembly and the state senate. But we don't see it here. I would say, to finish off, that as spectacle, that is, voters, the electorate watching D.C. politics, watching these proposals come over and get handled by the Hill, it's most unlikely that the public sees a party-specific difference in success rates. It's just altogether too common that we see presidents of both parties succeed and presidents of both parties fall flat on their face in making these big proposals. As in the case of successes, we have Reagan with his tax cuts, and we have Clinton with his budget. His budget in 1993 was a big success, 93. Lyndon Johnson with his many victories in 1965, 66, we have that. But we also see Clinton with his health care plan, and we see spectacularly Bush 43 with his privatization of the Social Security plan in 2005, 2006. It's obvious, or it ought to be obvious to everybody, that presidents of both parties can fall on their faces in a spectacular way. Given this, it's not surprising. I don't know of a case out there right now, and when there is a, as we'll see next time, or as you already know, when there is even a reasonably partially significant case for some kind of tilt or unfairness in the system, scholarship flows and journalists talk and politicians whine. It's out there, and I just don't see that sort of thing going on with this particular facet of politics I'm looking at today. The equation results here, to finish things off, they're consonant at least with the commonality across the relative commonality across the medians in the national popular vote that I gave you a picture of earlier. That's it. 531.
Okay. We have some remaining time. If anyone would like to ask any questions, if you would, we'd like for you to come down to the microphone so that the auditorium can hear the question. Any questions? Okay. Well, we'll welcome you back tomorrow at 4:30. It's in this room, correct? For the second installment. Thanks very much.